She grabbed my arm. I need you to do something right now before she deletes it and posts me online.
Okay, tell me exactly what happened, start to finish.
She rolled up with music, got disrespectful, called me racist, and then she grabbed me. I want this handled.
Stay right here with me. Don't walk toward her.
I'm telling you.
Separately.
Tell me what happened from your side and keep it simple.
He ordered me to turn my music off like he owned the place. Shouted racist phrases at me.
Did you touch him at any point? Grab his arm?
No, I didn't touch him. Not once.
She's lying. She grabbed my arm.
Do you have video of the interaction?
Yes, right here. I've been recording.
Turn around, hands behind your back.
Janelle Carter kept her phone up at chest level, steady like she'd done it 100 times, while Chase Whitaker stood a few feet closer than he needed to, talking fast, louder than the music ever was. He was telling the responding officers that she had grabbed his arm and attacked him, and he wanted them to do something right now, before she deleted everything and posted him online. This is one of those situations that starts off sounding almost ridiculous, until you realize how dangerous ridiculous can get when it's backed by a badge. And the scariest part? If one tiny detail hadn't changed, it could have ended very differently. Before we rewind, tell me where you're watching from, country or state, in the comments. And if you're into stories where cameras, receipts, and calm boundaries beat loud accusations, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. It happened at a Love's gas station on August 29th, 2025. One of those bright, always busy travel stops where people come and go like background noise. Plenty of cameras, plenty of witnesses, and plenty of room for a small confrontation to turn into a police report. Janelle was known there, not famous, just familiar. Staff recognized her face, her car, the way she came in, grabbed what she needed, and left without drama. She wasn't the type employees had to watch, and that mattered later more than anyone realized at the start. Chase wasn't a regular to the staff in the same way. That didn't mean anything by itself, but it meant nobody at the store had a pre-built story about him. So when he started giving officers a confident version of events, the only thing backing it up was his voice. The call that brought police out was a battery complaint. Chase had reported that a woman had battered him. He described her outfit purple and her car, black Mercedes. He said she pulled up with loud music, cursed at him, called him racist, threatened to put him on social media, then grabbed his arm. He told dispatch he wanted officers to hurry. That hurry part wasn't accidental. Chase was trying to control the pace before anyone could slow the story down and test it. When officers arrived, he leaned into urgency. His body language said he wanted them to treat the situation like it was already decided. He kept circling back to the same points: loud music, disrespect, being called racist, and the arm grab. He framed it like he was minding his business and got attacked for it. Janelle's posture stayed different. She didn't perform panic. She didn't do the dramatic hands-up innocence act either. She gave what sounded like a timeline, not a speech. According to her, the music wasn't blasting. She said Chase had aggressively ordered her to turn it off, and it wasn't a request, it was a command. She said he followed her, staying in her space, and she started recording because she didn't trust what he might claim later. She denied touching him at all. And she said the first time he described it as her hitting or grabbing him was after officers were already on scene. That last detail is the kind of detail that can change everything. Because in a lot of parking lot calls, the first story officers hear becomes the default story. Whoever seems calmer gets believed. Whoever sounds most certain gets believed. Whoever uses the right keywords gets believed. But Officer Luis Ramirez and Officer Shannon Price didn't lock onto Chase's certainty. They did something simple that a lot of people don't expect in the middle of a messy accusation. They looked for proof. Janelle already had her phone video. She didn't act like it was a weapon. She treated it like a seatbelt, something you hope you never need, but you're glad you put it on. While one officer kept both parties separated, the other watched the clip, and the video didn't match the claim. On the recording, Chase was seen making the accusation that Janelle had grabbed him, while Janelle was clearly not within arm's reach. Officers estimated she was about 10 feet away when he said it. Not 2 feet. Not close enough for a quick grab. 10 feet. That doesn't just poke a hole in a story. It changes what the story is. Now, the incident wasn't simply a dispute about music. It wasn't even just a disagreement about who was rude first. It became a question of whether Chase had called 911 and accused someone of battery without it happening. And while the officers were processing that, the store employees started adding context. Devin Pike, one of the employees working that shift, told officers Janelle was a regular and didn't cause problems. Another staff member backed it up. Then the shift manager, Tina Alvarez, got involved and told officers she could call a manager to access surveillance footage because there were cameras pointed at the pumps and a good chance the area was covered. That offer mattered. It signaled that the store wasn't afraid of what the cameras would show. It signaled confidence. Chase, meanwhile, didn't have any footage. He didn't have a witness stepping up for him. He had his claim. And then he admitted something that officers often listen for. He had no video proof of her grabbing his arm. In a world where everybody's phone is always out, that's not automatically a lie. Plenty of real incidents don't get recorded, but here, the person he was accusing did have a recording, and it contradicted him in a clean, measurable way. Distance. This is where the power chess part shows up. Chase had tried to use the system as leverage. He used key phrases that make police move fast. Battery, aggressor, hurry, threat to post online. He pushed the idea that he was being targeted and harassed. But Janelle's move wasn't louder. It was cleaner. Recurred first. Speak second. Keep space. Let the facts carry the weight. The officers didn't rush to make her prove she didn't do it. They did what they were supposed to do. Compare statements to evidence. And once the evidence didn't match Chase's allegation, the direction of the call flipped. Instead of treating Janelle like a suspect, officers started treating Chase's report like the potential offense. He wasn't just mistaken. The accusation was specific. He said she grabbed his arm. He called 911 for it. He wanted immediate action. Yet the only video in play showed him making the claim while she was too far away to have done what he said. That's not a gray area, that's math. At that point, officers detained Chase. His tone shifted, less certainty, more frustration. The officers stayed procedural. They weren't debating him, they were documenting. He was arrested for making a false report. On top of that, he was cited for disorderly conduct and obstruction, based on how he acted during the investigation and response. Janelle wasn't celebrated. She wasn't treated like a hero. She was treated like what she was, the person who didn't lie, didn't escalate, and had receipts. Before officers cleared the scene, they gave her contact information and asked her to send any additional videos she had for the case. That detail is important too. It showed they were building the report around evidence, not around whoever shouted first. And just like that, a moment that could have gone sideways at a gas station ended with the person who made the accusation being the one put in cuffs. As soon as Chase Whitaker realized the call wasn't going the way he expected, his whole strategy changed. A minute earlier, he'd been pushing urgency, trying to make the officers treat his story like it was already proven. But the second officer, Luis Ramirez, pointed out the distance issue on Janelle Carter's video. Chase stopped acting like the victim of a battery and started acting like someone trying to talk his way out of consequences. He began reframing. He leaned into the idea that the whole thing was a misunderstanding. He tried to make it about feelings instead of facts. He tried to make it about respect again. But police reports don't run on vibes. They run on timelines. Officer Shannon Price did what good officers do in messy public disputes. She separated the noise from the measurable. She kept asking the same kinds of questions: where everyone stood when the supposed contact happened, how it happened, what came before it, and what proof existed of any of it. Chase's answer kept landing in the same place. He didn't have proof of the arm grab, and the only video being shown didn't support his claim. And Janelle didn't try to win the conversation. She stayed in her lane. She kept her voice level. She kept space between herself and Chase. She let the records speak. That's the part a lot of people don't understand until they're in it. Calm isn't weakness. Calm is control. While Chase was detained, the store side of the story got even clearer. Devin Pike and shift manager Tina Alvarez weren't trying to take sides emotionally. They were doing something more useful than that. They were offering context and access. They explained to the officers that Janelle was a regular who didn't cause problems. Not perfect, not an angel, just consistent. The kind of customer who didn't bring drama into their store. That alone didn't prove innocence. But it mattered because it lowered the odds that she randomly snapped into violence at a pump. Then Tina made the next move that pushed the whole situation from a parking lot argument into a documented case. She initiated the process to get surveillance. Love's Locations didn't just hand footage out to anybody, and Tina knew it. She called for a manager and started the standard chain to access camera angles. The officers didn't treat it like overkill. They treated it like confirmation. Because if the cameras showed no physical contact, then this was bigger than a rude exchange. It was a false report with a named person and a serious allegation. And here's something people don't talk about enough. A false report doesn't just waste time. It puts a target on someone who didn't do anything. It invites escalation. It can become an arrest that never should have happened. That's why the tiny detail mattered so much. The distance on the phone video. If Janelle hadn't been recording, the officers would have been standing there with two competing stories and one person insisting he was attacked. In plenty of places, that's enough to make the wrong decision in the moment. Instead, the officers had a clip that froze reality. When Chase was taken into custody, it didn't look dramatic. It looked procedural. He was searched, handcuffed, and walked to the patrol vehicle. The energy at the pump dropped immediately once he was no longer controlling the scene with his voice. Janelle didn't celebrate. She didn't perform relief for anyone. She looked like someone who just dodged something she didn't want to think about. Officer Ramirez gave her contact information and instructions for sending over any additional recordings. He also explained what would likely happen next in the simplest terms, because the next part is where people get lost. Reports, evidence uploads, statements, follow-up calls, court dates if needed. Tina and Devin stayed nearby, not hovering, just present. It mattered that Janelle wasn't standing alone while paperwork got finished. It mattered that witnesses were willing to attach their names to what they'd observed, that she wasn't the problem customer, and that they were confident enough to push for camera footage. And meanwhile, Chase's original 911 call wasn't just floating in the air anymore. It became part of the case file. His words, how urgent he sounded, how sure he acted, how he described the alleged battery, were now evidence too. Back at the station, the pieces started lining up in a way Chase probably didn't anticipate. Officers had a false allegation of battery tied to a specific person, a phone video that contradicted the key claim, on-scene admission that he had no video proof, store employees willing to support the idea that the accused person wasn't creating problems, pending surveillance access that could further confirm or deny physical contact. That's not a messy he said, she said. That's a case with an obvious direction. And this is where viewers should ask themselves something. How many people have had the opposite outcome just because they didn't think to record? Over the next couple of days, the incident didn't disappear. Gas station staff talked. Regulars talked. People who weren't even there started hearing the story in pieces, first as gossip, then as a warning. But Janelle didn't run to social media immediately, even though Chase had tried to paint her like someone who would. She focused on the boring part, sending the videos to the officers, saving backups, and writing down everything she remembered while it was still fresh. Time, location, who said what, where everyone stood. That's what accountability actually looks like. Not a viral clip, a clean record. Chase, on the other hand, had a different kind of record being built around him now. His charge for making a false report wasn't just a slap on the wrist. It meant he'd have to answer for why he escalated a confrontation into a criminal accusation without proof. And once a prosecutor saw that phone video detail, the claim happening while the accused stood about 10 feet away, there was no way to pretend it was just confusion. The system doesn't always protect the right person, but when evidence is this clear, it becomes harder for anyone to ignore. And that's where the real consequences started. When Chase Whitaker's case hit court, he didn't look like the guy who demanded officers hurry. He looked like someone who'd finally realized that a 911 call didn't disappear just because the moment was over. The prosecutor didn't need a dramatic angle. The file already had a clean timeline. Chase had called police from the Loves on August 29, 2025, and reported a battery. He had identified Janelle Carter by outfit and car. He had described an arm grab as the reason for the call. Then, when officers arrived, Janelle had a phone recording that showed Chase repeating the allegation while she was clearly several steps away. Store employees had backed up that she was a regular who didn't cause trouble, and surveillance access had been initiated to confirm what the officers were already seeing. The physical contact claim didn't match reality. Chase tried to turn it into a story about disrespect and being embarrassed. He leaned on the argument that he felt threatened and reacted in the moment. But the court kept dragging it back to one point. He didn't report a feeling. He reported a specific act of violence. And when the judge looked at how the allegation was made, how it changed, and what the evidence showed, the case became about accountability for using the system as a weapon. The result wasn't a movie ending. It was the kind of ending that follows people quietly. Chase dealt with the consequences of being charged for a false report. The disorderly conduct and obstruction issues followed him too, tied to how he behaved during the response once officers started checking his story instead of accepting it. Court costs, penalties, and a case record were the kind of consequences that didn't go viral, but absolutely changed what future paperwork and background checks would look like. While Chase tried to manage fallout, Janelle did something that mattered more than arguing with anyone afterward. She treated the whole thing like a lesson in preserving proof. She submitted every video clip she had in full, with original timestamps intact. She saved backups in more than one place. She requested the incident report through the proper process and kept the confirmation trail. She wrote down the names connected to the case: Officer Luis Ramirez, Officer Shannon Price, Sergeant Dane Holt, plus the Love's staff who stepped up: Tina Alvarez and Devin Pike. Not to build a social media moment, to build a record. She also contacted Love's corporate customer relations, not to blame the store, but to make sure the location's cooperation and surveillance process were documented from the business side too. That move mattered because companies pay attention when an incident shows they could be pulled into liability or public scrutiny later. Love's didn't dismiss her. The store staff had done the right thing. They stayed neutral, offered surveillance access, and helped stabilize the situation by backing facts instead of drama. Inside that Love's after August 29th, the atmosphere shifted in small ways. Employees got quicker about pulling a manager in when someone started trying to control another customer. They stopped brushing off early warning signs like aggressive commands, following too close, and escalating a petty argument into a police-level accusation. Tina made sure staff understood the difference between a loud customer and a customer trying to use authority as a threat. Janelle didn't walk away thinking the world had suddenly become fair. She walked away knowing one ugly truth and one useful truth. The ugly truth was that she could do everything right and still be accused. The useful truth was that documentation could keep an accusation from turning into handcuffs. That night could have ended differently if one tiny detail hadn't been there. Video showing distance, clearly enough that nobody could pretend it was a mystery. So here's what this story really teaches. When someone tries to turn a personal confrontation into a police problem, staying calm is only half the battle. The other half is preserving the truth in a way the system can't ignore. Now, let me ask you, if you were in Janelle's position, would you have started recording right away? Or would you have assumed the truth would speak for itself? Drop your answer in the comments, and if you want more story times where receipts beat loud accusations and accountability actually shows up, hit like, share this with someone who needs it, and subscribe for more.
So it's clear.
I'm recording because you walked up recording us.
What are you taking pictures of? Why are you here?
We're filming in public. You don't need our personal details.
Michigan plates. That tells me everything. You're not from here.
So because we're black and not from here, you're treating us like suspects?
Yes. I'm racist.
Jalen saw it in the man's hands first, phone up, already recording, before he even heard the footsteps. Old Town was still waking up. Stores were dark. Streets were quiet. And yet this 72-year-old white man walked straight toward two black men with a camera, like he'd been waiting for a reason. He didn't start with a greeting. He started like an interrogation. This is one of those situations that starts off sounding almost ridiculous, until you realize how dangerous ridiculous can get when it's backed by a badge. And the scariest part? If one tiny detail hadn't changed, it could have ended very differently. Quick thing, where are you watching from? Drop your city or state in the comments. And if you watch stories about people getting exposed when they try to play neighborhood police, hit like and subscribe, because this one turns ugly fast, and then it turns expensive. Now, rewind, because the setup matters. It was early morning in Old Town Scottsdale, the kind of place that sells a safe image, like it's part of the sidewalk. Everything looks controlled. Everything looks curated. And that's exactly why what happened next felt so calculated. Jalen and Dominic were there to film. They weren't yelling. They weren't blocking anybody. They weren't breaking rules. Just two black men working with professional gear, catching clean morning shots while the streets were empty. Then Paul showed up. Paul didn't come over like a curious local. He came over like he'd already made a call in his head. He started recording them immediately and pressed them with questions about what they were photographing and why they were there. The way he asked wasn't curiosity, it was accusation. Like the camera itself was suspicious and the people holding it had to prove they had a right to stand on that sidewalk. Jalen and Dominic didn't feed it. They stayed calm and made it clear they weren't obligated to answer. They kept their own camera up too, because the first rule of situations like this is simple. If someone is recording you like a suspect, you record them back like evidence. That's when Paul changed angles. He stopped focusing on the filming and started digging into identity. He pressed for where they lived. He pushed for personal details. He tried to turn the conversation into a background check. And then he found what he thought was his winning card. Their car had Michigan plates. Paul pointed it out like he'd just solved a case. The out-of-state plate became his proof that they didn't belong, that this wasn't normal, that this was something he needed to confront. This part is important because it's a common move. If you can't openly say you don't want certain people in your space, you pick something else, plates, clothes, time of day, and act like you're just being careful. But Jalen didn't let him hide behind that. He called out what it felt like, racial suspicion dressed up as neighborhood concern. And here's the moment everything shifted. Paul didn't deny it. He didn't correct it. He didn't do the usual scramble. No, I treat everyone the same. No, you're misunderstanding me. No, I'm just looking out. Paul said he was racist, out loud, like it was a badge he'd earned. Then he tried to justify it by talking about the area like it was some restricted zone, like a no zone, as if he had authority to decide who gets to exist there without being questioned. That's the mask-off moment. Because once someone admits that, the confrontation isn't about cameras anymore. It's about power. It's about intimidation. It's about what he thinks he can get away with. And Paul acted like he could get away with a lot. He stepped closer. He crowded them. He kept his phone trained on them while pushing into their space like he wanted them uncomfortable enough to leave on their own. When Jalen and Dominic held their ground, Paul tried control through tone. He talked like they weren't allowed to respond. Like any pushback was talking back. Like he was disciplining them instead of speaking to equals. And when even that didn't work, when they still didn't leave, still didn't shrink, still kept recording, Paul escalated again. He started threatening force, not hypothetical, not joking. The kind of lines meant to make two men decide whether to risk a fight or walk away. Jalen and Dominic didn't mirror him. They didn't step into his chaos. They did something smarter. They went firm and procedural. They told him to back up. They told him to stop crowding them. They made it clear they felt threatened. They warned him not to touch them. And in that quiet early morning street, with fewer people around and less accountability in the moment, those cameras became the only thing keeping this from turning into Paul's private version of justice. Because here's what Paul didn't expect. They weren't leaving, and they weren't going to let him rewrite the story later. They were building a record in real time. And Paul, still recording, still pressing, still acting like he ran the sidewalk, was about to say and do the exact things that would follow him for the rest of his life. By lunchtime, the clip wasn't just a weird morning anymore. It was everywhere. People weren't arguing about what happened. They were arguing about what it meant. And that's because the video didn't leave room for interpretation. It showed an older man walking up like he owned the sidewalk, recording two black men like suspects, and escalating when they refused to submit. Old Town Scottsdale is the kind of place where reputation matters. Businesses depend on the image. And once that video started picking up traction, it stopped being a personal confrontation and became a public problem. That's why the police reached out the same day. Not because Jalen and Dominic did anything wrong, because they didn't, but because the internet had already done what it always does. It forced the situation into the light. When officers contacted Paul, they didn't come at him like he was a criminal right away. They did what police do when they're trying to pin down the facts. They asked what led to the encounter. Paul's response told them everything. He didn't describe it as a neighbor moment. He described it like a security incident. He said he saw two black men with a sophisticated camera and decided it didn't look like tourism. He framed their presence like it was suspicious by default, like the burden was on them to prove they weren't a threat. Then he reached for his justification. He claimed he was watching for trouble because of protests and unrest. Like that turned his assumptions into responsibility. And here's where it gets even more revealing. Paul admitted he took a picture of them first. Not a casual photo, not a harmless snapshot. He presented it like documentation, like he was collecting intelligence. He said they took exception, as if their reaction was the problem instead of his behavior. Then he told the officers what he did next. He forwarded the photo to a nearby shop owner. That's an escalation a lot of people miss in the moment, because it sounds small until you think about it. That wasn't just being nosy. That was trying to build a little neighborhood network, trying to turn a stranger's suspicion into a community warning. And Paul wasn't done. He told police he went back to get a clearer picture of the license plate. Not because anyone asked him to. Not because a crime happened. Because in his words, he believed they looked like a recon team. That phrase matters. Recon team isn't a normal word for tourists. It's a word that turns two people with a camera into an enemy unit. It's how someone justifies treating a sidewalk like a checkpoint. And while he was saying all this to police, he spoke like it would all make sense if people just listened long enough. But the officers weren't there to agree with him. They were there to document his choices. And they could hear what he couldn't. The way he described two black guys wasn't neutral. It wasn't a detail. It was the foundation of his suspicion. He didn't say, I saw two people with a camera. He led with race, then added the gear, then added a story about unrest, then landed on the conclusion, threat. That's the chess game. You stack reasonable sounding pieces until the bias looks like logic. But the video existed. The internet had it. And now the police had Paul on record explaining his thinking in his own words. And that's why what happened next didn't stay dead by next Tuesday. Because the next day, officers came back. Not to chat. To confront him with the reality he kept dodging. His behavior wasn't just offensive. It was provocative enough to start a physical fight. They challenge him directly, ask him to imagine being on the receiving end of it. And Paul does what people like him often do when they realize the room has changed. He tries to minimize. He tries to shrug it off. And then, because the city has the video, his statements, and the escalation, everything flips. The next day, police didn't call Paul to check in. They showed up. Because once something like that goes viral, it stops being a he said. It becomes a public record. And Scottsdale PD had two problems on their hands: the incident itself and the fact that Paul looked comfortable doing it. When officers spoke to him again, they weren't interested in his theories about cameras or recon. They focused on what actually creates danger in the real world: the way he approached, the way he escalated, and the way his words could have triggered a fight in the middle of Old Town. They pressed him on the obvious point. His comments weren't just rude, they were provocative. A stranger walks up recording, interrogates people, crowds them, then starts talking like he's ready to put someone on the ground. That's how people get hurt. Paul didn't meet them where they were. He minimized. He framed it like a misunderstanding that would fade out on its own, acting like the internet was dramatic, and the whole thing would be forgotten in days. He talked like this was a temporary inconvenience, not a serious escalation that he started. The officers didn't treat it like a temporary inconvenience. They challenged him to imagine being on the receiving end. Two men minding their business, getting filmed and interrogated, then threatened. They made it clear that what he did wasn't neighborhood watch. It was confrontation. Paul still acted like it wasn't that big, so they made it big. They placed him under arrest for disorderly conduct. And that's when Paul's confidence finally cracked, not into remorse, but into surprise. He didn't expect the system he'd been leaning on culturally to turn and face him. During the arrest process, officers did what they always do. They asked about weapons. Paul admitted he had them. He said yes without hesitation, like it was normal, like it was just how life worked. And he tried to frame it that way, like carrying was standard, like it shouldn't matter. But it mattered. Because now the situation had a sharper edge. This wasn't just an older man running his mouth. This was an older man threatening physical force, while also being armed. And that explained the tiny detail that changed everything. Jalen and Dominic had cameras up. They didn't rely on someone else to tell their story later. They didn't assume people would be fair. They documented it in real time. Without that, Paul's version, suspicious guys, sophisticated camera, recon, I was being careful, could have been the only narrative that mattered. But with video, the narrative couldn't be rewritten. After the arrest, the consequences moved fast. Paul wasn't just facing a charge and an embarrassed moment. His professional life got pulled into it too. His real estate agency cut ties with him and recommended his license be revoked. They didn't treat it like personal opinions. They treated it like conduct that reflected back on them. And on the other side, one of the men made it clear he didn't want a quiet apology or a slap on the wrist. He wanted the case pushed as far as possible, not out of revenge, but to set a public boundary. You can't confront people like that, threaten them, and then act like it's normal. The story had started on a calm, old town sidewalk. It ended with an arrest, a charge, and a man learning that neighborhood authority doesn't mean anything when the evidence is clear. The arrest didn't end the story. It stabilized it. Because the moment Paul was taken in, the conversation online shifted from outrage to receipts. People stopped asking what happened and started tracking what consequences looked like in real life. The video kept circulating, but now it was paired with the details everyone had been waiting for. Police had contacted Paul the same day, challenged him the next, and then arrested him for disorderly conduct. That timeline mattered. It showed the system didn't just watch the internet argue, it acted. In Scottsdale, word traveled the way it always does, faster than officials, faster than statements. Old Town business owners saw it. Regulars saw it. People who recognized the street corners saw it. And a lot of them understood the quiet part. If this could happen to two men holding a camera in broad daylight, it could happen to anybody who looked wrong to the wrong person. The shop owner Paul had messaged got pulled into the story too, whether they wanted to or not. Because Paul had described to police that he'd sent a photo over, like it was a neighborhood warning. That meant he wasn't just confronting strangers. He was trying to recruit other people into his suspicion, to normalize the idea that filming while black in Old Town needed to be monitored. But the biggest pressure point hit Paul where he didn't expect it. His job. The internet is loud, but employers move quietly and quickly when their brand is on the line. Paul's real estate agency didn't frame it as two sides. They didn't treat it like a misunderstanding. They cut ties with him and recommended action against his license. That decision told the public something important. This wasn't just opinions. This was behavior. The kind that could cost clients, endanger coworkers, and drag the company into lawsuits and headlines. Meanwhile, Jalen and Dominic were still dealing with the part people rarely talk about, the aftershock. Even when you win the moment by staying calm and recording, your body remembers the threat, the crowding, the intimidation, the fact that a stranger felt comfortable telling you he could put you on the ground in an empty street. They didn't try to turn it into a performance. They kept it practical. One of them went public with a clear goal. He wanted the case prosecuted as far as possible, not because he thought punishment fixes everything, but because a public example sets a boundary. It tells the next person thinking of doing this that the outcome isn't a viral clip and a shrug. It's handcuffs, a record, and fallout. And that was the real shift. Paul had tried to control the story from the first second by recording them first, labeling them outsiders, and treating their presence like a threat. But once the footage spread, he lost control of what mattered most: how the public saw it, how police documented it, and how institutions responded to it. Old Town went back to looking calm. Same sidewalks, same morning light. But now everyone knew what safe had meant to Paul, and what it could cost when someone like him decided to act on it. A week later, Old Town Scottsdale looked the same. Morning walkers still moved through the same streets. Tourists still took selfies by the same corners. Cameras still pointed at murals, storefronts, sunlit sidewalks. But Jalen and Dominic weren't looking at the neighborhood the same way anymore. Because the lesson wasn't that one rude man got arrested. The lesson was how fast a normal moment can turn into a confrontation when someone decides they have the right to police you. Paul never needed a uniform to act like an officer. He didn't need permission to interrogate strangers. He didn't need proof to assume the worst. All he needed was confidence, an audience he thought would side with him, and a story he could tell himself, that he was protecting something. That's the trick in a lot of these situations. The person escalating doesn't see it as escalation. They see it as duty. And that's why the tiny detail mattered. The reason this didn't end worse was simple. The cameras were already rolling, and Jalen and Dominic didn't surrender control of the narrative. They didn't get baited into swinging first. They didn't get baited into saying something they'd regret. They stayed calm, stayed firm, and kept repeating the only boundary that matters in a situation like that: back up, don't touch, stop crowding. Then they let the evidence do the heavy lifting. Because once the video hit the internet, Paul's favorite weapon, his confidence, turned into his biggest liability. His words didn't sound like concern. They sounded like what they were: suspicion aimed at two black men for existing in the wrong place with the wrong look, plus threats meant to force them to leave. And when police got involved, Paul's own explanation didn't help him. He doubled down. He described them by race first. He framed their equipment like it was criminal. He called them a recon team. He admitted he tried to gather identifying details. He treated a public sidewalk like a controlled zone. Even after officers challenged him on how provocative he'd been, he still talked like it would blow over. It didn't. He got arrested for disorderly conduct. He admitted he had weapons. His agency fired him and pushed for his license to be revoked. And the men he confronted made it clear they wanted prosecution taken as far as possible, because the point wasn't just punishment, it was precedent. And accountability doesn't always come from someone doing the right thing in the moment. Sometimes it comes from the public seeing the truth clearly enough that institutions can't ignore it. Now let me ask you something. If you were Jalen or Dominic, would you have stayed and kept filming? Or would you have left the second a stranger started interrogating you? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you've ever been put in a situation where someone tried to act like they had authority over you in public, share that too. People learn from each other's patterns. And if you want more story times where dignity wins, receipts matter, and people who try to intimidate strangers end up facing real consequences, make sure you like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one.
We need to check your belongings.
I do not consent to a search. Get a supervisor.
Ma'am, stop resisting. These credentials are fake.
This looks like impersonation.
The hallway was already empty when it turned into a checkpoint. Judge Alana Pierce was in a dark judicial robe, her tote on one shoulder, her phone in her hand, and the long day exhaustion still sitting behind her eyes. She'd cleared the last security door and was walking through the exit corridor, the part of the federal courthouse that was supposed to lead straight out. That's when two officers stepped in from the side, like they'd been waiting for someone to pass. The first one, Officer Edward Danner, positioned himself in the narrowest part of the corridor. The second, Officer Tyler Reese, stood a half step behind him, angled like a backup plan. And in seconds, the whole space changed. Danner started with what sounded like casual questions, but his body language didn't match casual. He kept his stance squared, eyes fixed, voice controlled in that way that wasn't friendly. It was measuring. Reese kept scanning the area like he expected her to run. Pierce kept moving at a normal pace until Danner made it clear she wasn't getting by. She calmly explained who she was and why she was there. A federal judge finishing a late day, leaving the building like everyone else. They didn't shift. They didn't soften. They didn't step aside. Instead, they pressed harder, wanting details, wanting her destination, wanting her job said in the exact phrasing they would accept. And when she didn't play along with the tone change, the questions started acting like orders. The moment it stopped being awkward and became something else was when Danner demanded identification and then didn't give it back. Pierce stayed composed because she understood what this was turning into. Not a misunderstanding, not a mix-up, a power move. Danner looked at her ID, then at her face, then back at the ID again, like the facts were optional. Reese shifted closer, closing the corridor space behind her, subtle, but not subtle enough. Pierce didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue emotionally. She did what people with real authority do when they're being tested by fake authority. She narrowed it down to procedure. She asked if she was being detained and on what basis. And that's when Danner made the situation official without using the official word, by telling her she wasn't leaving until they verified who she really was. Narrator voice. Engaging phrase. This is one of those situations that starts off sounding almost ridiculous until you realize how dangerous ridiculous can get when it's backed by a badge. And the scariest part, if one tiny detail hadn't changed, it could have ended very differently. Before we rewind, drop where you're watching from. Country, state, city, wherever. And if you watch stories about accountability, power games, and people staying calm when the system tries to bully them, hit like and subscribe because this one shows exactly why evidence matters. Now, here's how it started. It was a late Tuesday night, the kind of late where the courthouse air felt stale and the building sounded bigger than it was. Most offices were dark. The staff that stayed past normal hours moved quietly and fast, like everyone was trying to finish their work without becoming anyone else's problem. Judge Alana Pierce had been inside since early morning. She wasn't a celebrity judge. She wasn't the type who walked around with an entourage. She was known for being prepared, direct, and unshakably professional, especially in a building full of people who tried to test boundaries for a living. That day had run long for reasons that weren't dramatic, just real. Hearings that stacked up, last-minute filings, a late motion that couldn't wait, and a final set of notes she refused to leave unfinished. The courthouse didn't shut down just because it was night. It just got thinner. Fewer eyes, fewer witnesses, more room for someone to do something wrong and claim nobody saw it. By the time she wrapped up, her robe was still on because she'd been moving from one task to the next, and she didn't think it mattered. It shouldn't have mattered. A judicial robe in a federal courthouse isn't a costume. It's not ambiguous. But Pierce also knew something most people learn the hard way. Uniforms don't protect you from bias. Sometimes they trigger it. She took the same exit route she always used after a late evening, the corridor that runs past the security screening area and funnels employees and authorized personnel toward the doors. Cameras covered it. Procedures existed. It was supposed to be clean. And as she approached the security exit corridor, she noticed something small at first. The usual overnight rhythm felt off. The security desk area wasn't busy, but it wasn't relaxed either. 2 officers she didn't recognize were posted near the exit zone, talking with that quiet intensity people get when they're bored, but still want to feel in control. Officer Edward Danner had the posture of someone who enjoyed being the final gate. Officer Tyler Reese had the energy of someone trying to prove he belonged next to Danner. Pierce didn't think about them for more than a second, because she had no reason to. She was in her workplace. She had access. She belonged there. And then, the second she passed the point where the corridor narrowed, Danner stepped in. At first, it looked like routine engagement, an officer acknowledging someone leaving late. But within moments, the tone turned. Not openly hostile. Worse than that. Suspicious. Danner's "Where are you headed?" turned into "Why are you here this late?" and then into "What exactly do you do here?" The pace of the questions didn't match safety. It matched testing. Pierce answered in a controlled, professional way. She stated she worked in law at the courthouse and was leaving after a long day. That should have ended it. Instead, Danner escalated like her calm made him angry. He demanded identification as if she'd just wandered in from the street. Pierce gave it because she had nothing to hide and because she also understood the reality. Refusing an ID request from someone determined to make a scene rarely ends well for the person without a weapon. The ID matched her name. Her credentials were real. Everything lined up. And Danner still didn't hand it back. He stared at it like he was hoping the plastic would change its mind. Reese leaned in and added a pressure. Questions about why she was alone, why she was out so late, whether she'd been drinking. Not because there was any sign of that. Because it's a humiliation tactic that's easy to say and hard to disprove in the moment. Pierce didn't take the bait. She didn't try to prove herself by over-explaining. She did what she did on the bench. She focused on the rules. She pushed back in measured terms, making it clear she wasn't required to answer random escalating questions without lawful reason. She pointed out that holding her ID and blocking the exit corridor was not a casual conversation anymore. And that's when Danner shifted into the most common cover language used in moments like this. He claimed they needed to verify her identity. But the real truth was simpler. He didn't believe she could be who she said she was. And he didn't want to admit he was wrong. Officer Edward Danner kept Judge Alana Pierce's ID in his hand, like it belonged to him now. He didn't step aside. He didn't return it. He didn't do the normal thing. Read it, confirm it, move on. Instead, he held the corridor. Officer Tyler Reese moved to Pierce's other side, not close enough to touch her, but close enough that the message was clear. She wasn't walking out unless they allowed it. Pierce stayed still. She didn't try to push past them. She didn't raise her voice. She kept her tone even and repeated what mattered. She worked in the building, her ID was valid, and she was leaving. Danner answered by adding more questions, not security questions, control questions. He pushed for where she was going, why she was out late, and what she was really doing in the courthouse after hours. Then he moved to the kind of accusation that's meant to embarrass and destabilize. Whether she'd been drinking. Pierce didn't argue about the insult. She corrected the process. She made it clear she wasn't required to answer random personal questions, and that holding her ID while blocking her path was not a voluntary conversation anymore. That's when Danner used the word he thought protected him: verification. He claimed the ID didn't look right and said they needed to verify her. He still didn't give a real reason. He didn't point to a policy. He didn't cite a call from inside. He didn't say there was a threat, a report, or a violation. He just said they were verifying. The problem was simple. In that corridor with her exit blocked and her ID withheld, verify meant detain, without saying the word. Pierce stayed controlled and asked for a supervisor. Reese responded by tightening the space again, turning his body so the corridor felt smaller. It wasn't a tackle. It wasn't a hand on her arm. It was the kind of positioning that lets people later say, nobody forced anything, while still making it clear you're not free. Pierce didn't flinch. She didn't plead. She did what she knew would matter later. She started tracking details in her mind: time, location, badge numbers, the fact that her ID was being held, the fact that she asked for a supervisor, the fact that they were blocking the exit. Danner didn't like that she stayed calm, so he changed tactics. He moved from questions to action. He told her they needed to check her belongings. Pierce did not consent. She told him clearly she wasn't giving permission for a search and asked again for a supervisor because she understood what was happening. Once the search happens, they can claim they found cause after the fact. Danner didn't stop. He reached for her purse. It happened fast and it happened messy. Not a careful check, not a respectful inspection. He grabbed the purse, pulled it open, and dumped it onto the courthouse floor. Her personal items scattered: keys, phone charger, a few papers, small everyday things that had nothing to do with any crime. The corridor lights made it all look worse, like a staged scene. Then the credentials fell out. Her federal judicial identification and courthouse credentials slid across the floor in plain view. This was the moment where a professional officer would pause. This was the moment where a normal person would feel embarrassed and back off. This was the moment where the entire situation could have ended with a quick apology and an awkward walkaway. But Danner didn't apologize. He went the other direction. He picked up the credentials, stared at them, and instead of admitting he was wrong, he tried to turn it into a bigger accusation. He claimed the judge credentials were fake. Then he escalated it into the one accusation that would justify everything he'd already done if people believed it. He implied she was impersonating a judge. Reese backed him immediately, like agreeing would make it true. And that's when Pierce understood the risk level changed. Because once someone decides to protect themselves with a false story, the goal is no longer to check facts. The goal is to build a narrative that makes them look justified. Pierce didn't argue in circles. She didn't beg them to believe her. She didn't start explaining her career history. She did the most important thing she could do in that moment. She quietly started recording, not in a dramatic way, not announced as a threat, just a calm decision because she knew what came next. Radio traffic, selective wording, and official claims that would be hard to fight without evidence. Right after she started recording, Danner began talking over the radio. He didn't describe it as a judge being stopped in the courthouse. He framed it as a suspicious person, late-night credentials in question, refusing to cooperate. He called for backup. And in that corridor, with her items on the floor and her exit blocked, Pierce realized the incident was no longer about who she was. It was about what they could claim she was. After Officer Edward Danner called for backup, the corridor stopped feeling like an empty hallway and started feeling like a staged scene. Officer Tyler Reese kept his position tight, staying close enough to control Judge Alana Pierce's movement without putting hands on her. Danner stayed focused on building a version of events that sounded official enough to survive questions later. Pierce didn't give them what they wanted. She didn't get loud. She didn't panic. She didn't start explaining her resume like she was on trial in a hallway. She stayed still, kept her tone level, and quietly recorded. Because she understood something most people don't realize until it's too late. Once officers start talking on the radio like you're a suspect, the incident stops being about the truth and becomes about what they can document first. The first wave of additional officers arrived and took their cues from Danner's posture. The energy came in ready to treat Pierce like a problem. But then a supervisor-level presence showed up who didn't match that energy at all. Detective Serena Holt. Holt took in the whole scene before speaking. The robe, the scattered items on the floor, the narrow exit corridor, the fact that two officers were acting like they had a suspect, but the suspect looked like someone who belonged in the building more than they did. Holt didn't argue with Danner. She didn't accuse him. She didn't give him a stage. She asked for the ID and credentials. Danner hesitated, but he handed them over. At that point, there were witnesses nearby and cameras above. He didn't control the narrative alone anymore. Holt looked at the credentials, then looked at Pierce, then made a verification call through the courthouse system. It was quick, direct, and final. The confirmation came back clean. Pierce was who she said she was. The credentials were real, the job matched, the access matched. The story Danner was building couldn't survive contact with a basic internal check. That was the exact moment the whole situation changed. Not because anyone suddenly felt guilty, because now the risk shifted from, how do we control her, to, how do we explain what we did? Holt didn't let them skip past the main issue. She pressed for what legal reason they had for stopping Pierce, taking her identification, blocking the corridor, and dumping her purse without consent. Danner tried to hide behind vague language, security, verification, policy. But Holt treated that the way experienced investigators treat it, like noise. She focused on concrete facts. There was no report of a threat. Pierce was leaving through a controlled exit route. She produced identification. There was no lawful basis to turn the interaction into a detention. And once they searched her property without consent, the situation moved from unprofessional to unlawful. Pierce didn't celebrate. She didn't insult them. She didn't need to. She simply gathered her belongings off the floor piece by piece, slow and steady, while courthouse staff watched. The night security lead, Mr. Ortega, had stepped closer by then, and his expression said enough. This wasn't a confusion anymore. It was a problem. Holt returned Pierce's identification directly to her. Then she ordered the corridor cleared. The officers stepped back, and Pierce walked out the way she should have been allowed to walk out from the beginning. But the incident didn't end when Pierce left the building. It followed them into reports, logs, and footage. Within days, the courthouse started doing what institutions always do when something goes wrong in a monitored space. They pulled records. Security cameras covered the corridor. The screening area had angles that showed the search. The radios had timestamps. The call for backup had language in it. And Pierce's recording captured the part the cameras couldn't capture perfectly: tone, sequence, and the way the officer's story evolved once the credentials hit the floor. Danner and Reese quickly realized their original narrative didn't fit the evidence. So the language in their paperwork shifted. What had been described out loud as a suspicious impersonator started turning into softer phrasing. They leaned on the most common defense used when there's no real justification. They claimed they were acting in good faith for safety, that they needed to verify, and that Pierce was uncooperative. But the footage didn't support that. The footage showed Pierce standing composed. It showed her handing over identification. It showed the corridor blocked. It showed her belongings dumped. It showed the moment the credentials appeared. And it showed the officers escalating after proof, not before it. The radio logs also didn't help them. The way Danner framed the call made it clear he was building suspicion, not responding to it. The timing showed how quickly it moved from questions to control. And multiple staff members confirmed what the cameras already suggested. Pierce was not acting erratic, not threatening, not trying to access anything she shouldn't. She was trying to leave. Once the internal review began, it became less about Pierce's status and more about the officer's conduct. That mattered because the defense they hoped to hide behind, we didn't know who she was, wasn't enough. Even if she weren't a judge, the stop still needed a legal basis. The search still needed consent or cause. The detention still needed justification. The impersonation claim still needed facts. And none of those pieces existed. Over the next several weeks, the consequences moved in layers. First came administrative action, formal complaints, review interviews, and command staff asking questions that couldn't be dodged with vague verification talk. Then came discipline measures depending on what internal policy and oversight required. Remedial training, suspension, removal from certain posts, and performance review flags that don't disappear. Then the legal layer tightened. Once you have unlawful detention, unlawful search, and an attempted false story, it stops being a small HR issue. It becomes liability. It becomes civil rights exposure. It becomes the kind of case that forces a department to explain itself with evidence, not excuses. Pierce didn't go on a media tour. She didn't need attention. She needed accountability and documentation. She filed the right reports, preserved her evidence, and let the system face the facts it created on camera. Because it happened in a courthouse, one of the most recorded government spaces that exists, the usual "it's your word against ours" didn't work. Policy changes came quietly, the way institutional changes usually do. Clearer after-hours exit protocols. Rules about when ID can be held and for how long. Mandatory supervisor involvement if a staff member or official is stopped without a specific call for service. Documentation requirements for any property search. Training updates that focused on one key point. Suspicion isn't a feeling you get to act on. It's something you have to justify. Pierce walked away with a blunt reminder. Status doesn't prevent profiling. A robe doesn't stop someone from deciding you don't belong. Titles don't protect you in the moment. What protects you is composure, boundaries, and proof. Because in the end, what started as a basic hallway encounter turned into a documented example of how fast verify can become detain, how fast detain can become search, and how fast search can become a false accusation when someone needs to protect their pride. And that's the lesson. When power acts reckless, it depends on silence. When truth has evidence, power has to answer. Now tell me this. What would you have done in Judge Alana Pierce's position? Would you have recorded, demanded a supervisor, or tried to leave? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you want more real, grounded storytime cases where accountability wins, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one.
Why are you here this late? What are you doing inside? Is this your store?
We're working. Nothing is happening here. Why are you treating this like a crime?
I've never seen it active at this hour.
Yeah,
so explain it. Prove it's yours.
If there's no alarm and no burglary call, what's the legal reason you're demanding proof?
The officer was standing in their doorway, like the store had tripped an invisible alarm. And Yema Khalif and Hawi Awash were already realizing this was not a quick check, because he kept demanding answers, like their presence needed permission. This is one of those situations that starts off sounding almost ridiculous, until you realize how dangerous ridiculous can get when it's backed by a badge. And the scariest part, if one tiny detail hadn't changed, it could have ended very differently. Before we run it back, comment where you're watching from. And if you watch these stories because you care about calm nerves, clean documentation, and real accountability, when authority starts pushing past its limits, hit like and subscribe, because that's exactly what this is. At around 1 a.m., Yema Khalif and Hawi Awash were inside their small neighborhood store in Tiburon, along with a third person who was with them that night, with the lights on and the space looking normal, like late night work was happening and nothing more. A police officer walked up and treated the scene like an issue that needed to be explained, not like a business handling its own night. He framed his approach as concern, but he kept circling the same suspicion, pressing them on why they were there, why they were open that late, and what they were doing, as if being inside was automatically something they had to justify. Yema and Howie stayed calm and answered in a steady way, but the officer kept escalating through repetition, acting like the fact that he personally had not seen the store active at that hour was enough reason to interrogate them. When they questioned why it mattered, he leaned into authority and tried to box them in with a simple power move. If it was not their store, then they had no standing to question him. And if it was their store, then they had to prove it to him. That was the trap, because either way the burden shifted onto Yema and Howie, and the officer positioned himself as the person who decided whether their explanation was acceptable. The situation tightened further when they noticed body language signaling escalation, including the officer keeping a hand in his pocket, and one of them asked him to de-escalate by removing it, not as a challenge, but as a safety boundary. Instead of treating that as a reasonable request, the officer made it about control, talking like it was his duty to protect the town and the property, while refusing to give basic accountability in return when Yema and Howie asked him to identify himself. That refusal was a turning point because it clarified the imbalance. He demanded answers, demanded compliance, demanded proof, but resisted even the simplest transparency about who he was. That was when Yema and Howie called out what they believed was the real trigger for the stop, pointing to the fact that there were 3 black people in the store late at night, and the officer tried to flatten it into a generic statement about 3 people of any background, but they kept the focus on the behavior, not the excuse. Not long after, additional officers arrived, including a supervisor, and the department's posture became the story, because now it was not one officer improvising. It was multiple officers deciding whether to correct the approach or reinforce it. The supervisor framed the encounter as standard policing, emphasizing the hour and claiming the store never had activity at that time. And Yema and Howie immediately demanded clarity about what the next step was, because they understood that vague suspicion could stretch forever if nobody forced it into specifics. The officers responded by demanding proof of ownership, pushing Yema and Howie to demonstrate they had keys and to physically use a key in the door as a test, as if the owners had to perform legitimacy in their own space just to make the pressure stop. Yema resisted because the demand was humiliating and backward, and the standoff held with the officers pressing for a prove-it moment, and Yema and Howie refusing to be treated like suspects without a real reason. And that was the moment the entire situation balanced on a single detail: whether anyone outside the couple would validate what should never have needed validation. The standoff didn't get louder, but it got sharper, because the officers stopped pretending they were just curious and started acting like Yema Khalif and Howie Awash had to pass a test to earn basic respect inside their own store. The supervisor held the line for the department, repeating that the hour alone justified the stop, and the other officers backed it with that quiet crowd pressure that makes a simple interaction feel like a courtroom where the civilians are the only ones on trial. Yema and Howie kept asking for the next step, not because they were confused, but because they understood the danger of an open-ended investigation based on vibes, where the officers could keep stretching the encounter until someone finally snapped and gave them an excuse. The officers answered by demanding proof, insisting that the owners show they had keys and physically demonstrate access, framing it as an easy way to end the situation, like it was a harmless request and not a public humiliation ritual. Yema resisted immediately, because the demand wasn't neutral. It was the department saying, "Prove you belong here to our satisfaction," even though there was no burglary call, no alarm, and no evidence that any crime had happened. That resistance turned the moment into a power contest because the officers didn't want to leave without winning something. And Yema didn't want to validate the idea that ownership needed to be performed for approval. Howie stayed steady beside him, reinforcing the same point with calm, clear pushback, keeping the focus on the logic. If there was no report of wrongdoing, then the officers needed a real reason to keep escalating. Not a feeling, not a hunch, not a personal opinion about what time a store should be active. The supervisor tried to keep it framed as normal policing, but the more he did that, the more it sounded like a policy problem, because normal in this context meant people getting treated like suspects purely because their presence looked unusual to an officer. The pressure built in small ways, with officers repeating the key demand, repeating the hour, repeating the idea that they were simply checking, while simultaneously treating a refusal as suspicious, which is the oldest trick in these encounters. Make compliance the only way out, then call anything else a threat. Yema and Howie didn't take the bait, and that mattered because they were playing the only chess game that works when you're outnumbered by authority. Stay calm, stay consistent, make them justify every step, and make sure the record shows who escalated and why. Then the tiny detail changed. A neighbor came up, described as a white resident from nearby, and spoke casually like this whole thing was obvious, vouching for Yema and Howie and confirming that it was their store. And the tone flipped so fast, it almost felt like a different scene. The officers immediately dropped the pressure, dropped the demands, dropped the posture, and shifted into polite closure, thanking the neighbor, acting friendly, and moving toward leaving, as if the last several minutes hadn't happened. That was the moment that exposed the real problem, because the owners didn't prove anything new about the store itself, and the officers didn't uncover any new facts about a crime, and no alarm suddenly appeared, and no report suddenly came in. The only thing that changed was whose voice carried weight. Yema and Howie had been saying calmly that there was no issue, that they belonged there, but that wasn't accepted as enough. The moment a white neighbor confirmed it, it became enough, and the encounter ended. That ending was the whole point, because it showed what the department was willing to treat as credible, and what it was willing to treat as questionable, even when the questionable thing was simply two owners standing in their own business at a late hour. Once the video circulated, the story stopped being about a late-night check and started being about a department getting caught on camera doing what people had been describing for years. Yema Khalif and Howie Awash didn't need to dramatize it because the footage did that work on its own. Multiple officers, no burglary call, no alarm, no concrete evidence of a crime. And still the owners were treated like they had to earn the right to exist in their own space. The backlash hit fast because the public could see the pattern clearly. Suspicion first, justification later, and then a sudden calm exit, the moment a white neighbor validated what the owners had been saying from the beginning. That public pressure pushed the situation out of the internal review zone and into a real-world consequences zone, where the town had to respond in a way that looked measurable. In the aftermath, Yema and Howie received a $150,000 settlement from the town of Tiburon, and they were explicit that the money wasn't just going into a private pocket, because they tied part of it to a scholarship effort connected to their store, aimed at supporting orphan youth in Ethiopia and Kenya. At the same time, the accountability didn't land neatly across every nearby jurisdiction involved, because the neighboring city, Belvedere, was not included in that settlement outcome the same way. And the broader fallout inside local law enforcement included major public scrutiny, internal shakeups, and leadership consequences that showed the department understood how bad it looked. But what mattered most was the choice Yema and Howie made about leverage. Instead of treating the settlement like an endpoint, they treated it like a bargaining chip, pushing the conversation toward policy changes that would outlive the headlines, because they understood something most people learned too late. Money closes a case, but reforms change the next case. So the focus shifted to what they demanded as part of the response. They pushed for updated policy and training standards, for a structure where community feedback wasn't just a comment box that got ignored, and for basic transparency tools that made it harder for officers to hide behind vagueness when people needed to file concerns. That's where the reforms started taking shape. A citizens' advisory panel was created as part of the response, and Yema and Howie were given seats, which mattered because it moved them from being treated like subjects of an incident to being treated like stakeholders with standing. Officers were also required to carry business cards that included clear information on how to file a complaint or concern, which sounds small, but it changes the power dynamic in everyday encounters because it makes the accountability path visible in the moment instead of buried later. A community liaison pilot program was introduced as another layer, aiming to narrow the gap between residents and law enforcement before incidents turned into confrontations. And the department increased the frequency of bias training, described as moving from a long cycle schedule to a tighter one, because the optics of "we do this once every several years" stopped sounding like professionalism and started sounding like negligence. Through all of it, Yema and Howie kept the core argument simple. The encounter was treated like a criminal scenario without any real criminal trigger, and the only reason it gained legitimacy in the officers' minds was when a white neighbor confirmed what the owners had already said. That's what made it a bias story, not a misunderstanding story. Because when there is no call, no alarm, and no evidence, but people still get forced to prove they belong, the proof was never about property. It was about permission. By the time the dust settled, the department's original framing didn't survive because the public had watched the same sequence too clearly to pretend it was routine. Yema Khalif and Howie Awash were treated like a problem first, and then everyone went searching for a reason second. That became the central contrast people couldn't unsee. There was no burglary call that night. There was no alarm going off. There was no report that anyone had forced entry. There was no concrete evidence of a crime in progress. Yet the owners still got boxed into an escalating set of demands where just answering wasn't enough and proving became the only exit. And the most telling piece wasn't even the demand for keys. It was how quickly the entire posture changed the moment a white neighbor vouched for them, because that moment showed the officers were not waiting on a fact. They were waiting on a specific kind of validation. That's why the community response didn't stay focused on one officer, because even when a supervisor arrived, the direction stayed the same. Treat the late hour as probable cause, treat refusal as suspicious, treat ownership as something that had to be demonstrated, and treat basic questions from the owners as if they were challenges to authority. So when backlash hit, it hit the department as a system. The fallout included public outrage, official embarrassment, and internal consequences that stretched beyond the street-level officers, because incidents like this forced leadership to choose between two options: admit the culture needs correction, or keep defending what the public can plainly see. In Tiburon, the visible response became a mix of settlement, reform promises, and structural changes that were designed to show this could not just be brushed away. The $150,000 settlement was one part, and Yema and Howie made sure it wasn't framed like hush money, tying part of it to a scholarship fund meant to benefit orphaned youth in Ethiopia and Kenya, because they wanted the outcome to produce something constructive instead of simply closing a file. But the bigger shift was what they demanded instead of chasing the largest possible payout. They pushed reforms that would change the daily mechanics of policing, not just the press releases. They pushed updated policies and training, and they pushed for community oversight through a citizens' advisory panel with seats for themselves, so the people who lived the consequences would have a voice in the process going forward. They pushed a business card requirement, so officers could not refuse basic identification and then disappear into the bureaucracy, and so residents would have a clear, immediate route to file concerns without having to guess what forms to find or who to call. They pushed a community liaison pilot because they understood that relationships don't get repaired through statements. They get repaired through consistent contact that doesn't start with suspicion. And they pushed more frequent bias training, described as moving from a long gap between sessions to a tighter schedule. Because we do this once in a while. Stop sounding like prevention when the damage is already recorded and replayed. The narrator's takeaway landed where the footage always pointed. This was not about the store being open late. This was about who the officers believed belonged there without proof. Because when a business owner has to prove he belongs inside his own store without any real evidence that a crime is happening, the system is not responding to a threat. It is creating one. And the scariest part is how close encounters like that sit to the edge, where one wrong tone, one misunderstood movement, or one officer deciding to escalate can turn a ridiculous situation into a life-changing one. So if you made it to the end, drop where you're watching from. And tell me if you've ever seen a situation like this play out in your own town. Because the details change, but the pattern stays the same. And if you want more stories where calm people document everything and still force accountability when the badge tries to push past its limits, hit like, subscribe, and stay here, because the next one is just as real.